Good day, chaps. So today's video is going to cover the A14 experimental pre-war tanks. Now this vehicle does not have many images at all, but a lot of written data, and being particularly rare. However, I will do the best I can. The A14 began in 1937 as part of a requirement for a new class of tanks to be drawn up for the 1938 tank programme. Britain had several tanks under review or design at the time, including the A11, A12 and A13, and had been testing the A7. However, none of these were a medium tank that fitted the specifications listed, with two being infantry tanks, one being a cruiser tank, and the A7 was a fast medium tank, but not quite what they were looking for. On the 9th of June, blueprints were drawn up, showing proposals of two medium tanks, one based on the A12 Matilda, which has been lost to time, and the second was based on a similar suspension, but larger and faster, which would become the A14. This led to a meeting on the 15th of June 1937, in which they agreed on a new specification and also agreed on using a Wilson steering system with a new engine. The first project on the A12 hull was dropped, and the second was agreed on, but on the condition that it had two small machine gun turrets. Again, the initial drawings only showed one turret to the left-hand side. However, when it comes to pointless little turrets, the British view is go large or go home, and so they looked at copying the ones from the A9, and Vickers were asked to provide the drawings. On the 17th of June, the new proposals were passed to the War Office, and a meeting attended by Sir Hugh Wells, Percy Hobart, and Martell, all who looked at the data. Hughes suggested that three tanks be tested for further ideas. These are to be the A7, A9 and the A10, and that if needed, the A9 would be a good stopgap tank while A14 was made. Once they had all agreed that adding the little turrets was the best thing since the invention of tea bags, they looked at serious issues, such as engines, a matter which had bedeviled British tanks, and they all agreed sensibly for once that the more powerful engine was needed for the future tanks. Thus they set out their long-term plans. A9 would be a short-term vehicle. Meanwhile, two working prototypes of A14 to be a mid-term vehicle, and then the A14 to be modified to fill the General Staff long-term project to be known as the A15 medium tank, not to be confused with the A15 heavy cruiser tank later on. The new tank was to go ahead and was dubbed the Modified Monster. On the 28th of June, they held a meeting to discuss what engines would be used. This was attended by Raymond Briggs, Major Pullman, and Admiral Harold Brown, each representing a branch of the forces. In this meeting, they laid out the options for future tank engines, as it was clear that they would need more power for the future, as well as reliability and ease of manufacturing. And the following engines were nominated: the Paxman Riccardo V12 at 600 brake horsepower, the Italian Isotta Fascini 500 horsepower engine, the Rolls-Royce Kestrel at 525 horsepower, and the Thornycroft RY12 at 500 horsepower itself. It was also decided that the Liberty engine was going to be the only suitable engine for cruisers, while the Christie type suspension should not be used, as Nuffields were working on this, and so the Vickers Horseman type would be used for the A14. The only problem with these new engines, however, is that it weighed too much for the proposed engine bay, which would mean larger hulls, which took the weight over the specified 25 tons, up to 28 tons. It was suggested they use the German engines by Junkers, and cut the operational range of the tank. However, Martell pointed out that these Junkers engines were not sufficiently developed to be placed into a tank, which was clearly a lesson we didn't bloody learn later on. However, the final choice was the Thornycroft RY12 35 litre 625 horsepower engine, normally used in motor torpedo boats, derated to 500 horsepower. They then set about who should build it and how. Interestingly, it was suggested that the tank could be built using high tensile steel and welding, rather than the riveting that the armour was used to. This idea was passed to the Institute of Welding for discussion, on whether such an idea would work. The team then had to choose a manufacturer for the two prototypes. They initially chose the Vulcan foundry, but these guys were tied up with producing the A12 Matilda, and so the designs were passed over to LMS in Horwich. By December 1938, war was clearly looming on the horizon. Hitler was being a muppet over in Europe, and the War Office began to step up production. It was decided that 40 vehicles would be the minimum amount that could be ordered to justify the development of the A14. However, with new insight into what the Germans were building, they also considered that 30mm of armour, as planned, might not be enough. They were also discussing the problems of building the A14 and the A16 at the same time, which would lead to a supply and demand bottleneck, with both tanks needing the Wilson transmission. They looked at both vehicles. The A16 was lighter, within the specs required, and cheaper, as well as a smaller target, but the suspension might be more problematic. The A14, on the other hand, was nearer completion, and would be ready first, but was more costly. Ultimately, they chose the A14 over the A16, and even went as far as saying they could put it into production without the pilot vehicles if required. The Chief of the Imperial General Staff looked at both, but was unhappy with the weight of the A41, which had crept over the limits. However, he was now more concerned with getting tanks out as fast as possible. Nuffields were told to keep working on the A16, while the A14 was to have two pilots, A14E1 and A14E2, and to be kept at no more than 24 tons, which was the limit of the new pontoon bridges. Meanwhile, the cruiser situation was to be sorted. A13's production was to be stepped up, as they were less risky than the others. 65 A13s would go to Nuffields, with a similar batch to LMS. Work on A14 continued at LMS, either at the Kentish Town Works in London, although some other sources have it being built at Crewe. Work progressed relatively swiftly, bar a few delays to the missing parts, and the mock-up was ready for trials on the 18th of May 1939. All seemed to be going well. However, 2 weeks later it was suggested the A14s be scrapped in favour of Nuffield's A15 heavy cruiser tank, which had now been given the name Crusader. This was due to the fact that the A14 was not an economical production based on its weight and the longer man-hours to build, compared to Crusader. However, on the 12th of June 1939, work was still going, albeit slowly. At this time, the General Staff acquired new photos from Germany of a new medium tank, and in the usual reactionary manner decided they needed a tank to stand up to this machine. The vehicle in question was estimated to be some 20 foot long and have two sub-turrets with the 75 and 37mm main guns, with armour they estimated at 25mm thick, which was fairly close guesswork. Thus the General Staff took a renewed interest in the A14 to counter this tank, and that a similar weight class with armour of about 40mm should suffice. It was discussed if A14E2 could fit into this role, and possibly fit with a 3-inch gun. Although such a weapon would be short with a low velocity, the contract to develop the gun was passed to Vickers. A new drawing was presented including a modified A14 and an A13 with an extra wheel, with A19's turret on a 64-inch ring, with a 3-inch gun, and another suggesting the use of the A19 turret on the Crusader hull. Both these ideas were dropped as it would interfere with production machines. A14's fate followed fairly quickly. At a meeting with Henry Evert from the LMRS, he cancelled all production with just one working prototype A14E1 made, as they believed the A13 was easier to make and they were now at war. Any other work would be carried over onto the A19 itself, which itself was later cancelled. The vehicle itself was deemed a lesson in failure. Not only did it never meet the required specifications, it failed to take on board the lessons from previous experimental tanks, although some efforts were made to work on suitable engineering and sensible ideas of welding were raised, and valuable data on the engine was gathered. The notion of these antiquated micro-turrets and suspension lessons, however, were not learnt, yet it remained an important vehicle in the British design and development story. Well guys, that's all we've got time for today on the A14. There aren't many pictures of this thing. If you did like this video though, or you do want to know more about these odd pre-war British tanks, do let me know below. and I can keep digging them up for you. If I do find more on this vehicle later on in my archive searches, we might come back to A14 and have another look at it. But until next time, toodle pip.